Everyone, today's practical practitioner session. My name is Lynn and today I'm going to be taking you through aggregating Hogan personality data to increase team effectiveness. So I will be your presenter for today. I'm also joined by my colleague Josh, who is going to be the moderator, so he will be keeping an eye on the chat today. So certainly feel free if you have any questions, any comments, any thoughts as we're going through, please share those in the chat. We'll also be having lots of discussion and participation at different points as we're going through. So during those times, feel free to unmute yourself, contribute to the discussion by sharing your thoughts and ideas. And if you're more comfortable sharing via the chat during those times as well, certainly feel free to put those in the chat and Josh will share those with us as well. So in terms of what we will be covering today, we are going to look at some of the options that are available when it comes to aggregating a team's personality data. And the majority of the time, really going to spend looking at how to really draw out those key insights about the team and what may be some of the key discussion areas that we really want to focus on as well when looking at the results. And sharing some different questions and focus areas that we may want to look at and think about when we're reviewing the aggregated data as well. So two of the main approaches that we tend to use and look at when we're looking at aggregated Hogan personality data is the Hogan group graphs that you can see on the left here. It's really a graphical depiction so we can see on average where does the score sit for the team across each of the different scales. It can also show the spread of scores across the team as well to understand where others may sit relative to each other. And the bottom graphic as well that you can see down there is a frequency graph. So this one is really useful in understanding within the group what is the frequency of those who scored in the high range for a particular scale, within the average range or the low range to understand the proportions within the group. So that's one option when we're looking at the aggregated data. There's also the Hogan team report as well, which is an off-the-shelf report which is designed to look at a team's collective personality data, provides insights around things like the kind of natural roles that people are likely to gravitate within the team, and similar to what we can look at in the group graphs as well, what are the shared derailers that we see within the team, as well as what is the shared values. So when we're looking at aggregated data, there's often a number of different questions that we may have in the back of our mind that we're wanting to pull out those insights. Firstly, it is important that we keep in mind the context for the team. So this includes aspects such as their role or function, the particular industry or sector that they're working within, as well as their particular objectives and outcomes, because that's probably going to shape some of the answers or some of the things that we may want to focus on when we're looking at some of the questions we see here on the slide. So, for example, common questions that we typically ask around things like, what are the strengths that we see coming through in this team? What are those strengths that they can leverage, that they can use to really help enhance their performance and achieve those specific goals and outcomes that they're designed to achieve? Similarly, what are some of the development opportunities that we see coming through for the team as well? And this can be particularly useful in helping the team develop some of that self-awareness around areas they may want to focus on as a team moving forward to help enhance their performance. Useful in terms of identifying areas they want to target as part of development programs for the team as well. For example, if communication comes up as a particular development area, you may want to have a specific module or part of the program that's targeted around helping them to enhance their communication. And really looking at the data, what's going to really help support or perhaps hinder their effectiveness. As I said, part of looking at the aggregated data as well is really around enhancing that self-awareness within the team as well. So an interesting question that we can look at is, does the team perhaps have any potential blind spots, which is where they may perhaps lack that awareness of a particular development opportunity. So, for example, the team may have a particular derailing behaviour that they tend to engage in when they are under that stress and pressure. They may regard it as normal because a lot of the team tend to share that behaviour, and so it's normal. Why do we need to change that or address that? May not necessarily pick up on that or have that insight around the potential impact around that derailer on their performance because of the collective manner in which that derailer plays out within the team. Looking at aggregated data can also be potentially a useful way to look at what may be sources of potential conflict or tension within the team as well, particularly when we have both the overall average within the team, but also potentially where we can see some of the individual data and see where there may be differences when people are sitting on a scale and how that may create perhaps some tension or conflict at times due to different approaches or perhaps different values. And finally, the last aspect that we may want to ask and look at as well, particularly when it comes to the MVPI, is around what is the team culture or what is the team shared values as well. So these are some of the common questions that we might ask or might think about or have in the back of our mind when we are reviewing aggregated data. I'll open it up. Does anyone have perhaps any other kind of questions or things that are running through their mind that they're wanting to look for when they are looking at the aggregated data? I take that as did a good job. Pretty comprehensive in terms of what we see here. So certainly these are definitely the main ones that we would keep in the back of our mind as we're going through and looking at the aggregated data. So we're now going to start diving a bit deeper around looking at some examples of some aggregated data, looking at pulling some insights from it. Starting with the HPI. So in terms of the HPI, when we're looking at it for a team, it's really starting to provide some insight around that team's day-to-day strengths, opportunities, and work style coming through there. And particularly when we're looking at, say, a group graph where the data has been aggregated, generally what we're looking at is really where does the team sit on each of the scales. So in general, are they sitting more towards the higher end of a particular HPI scale, or do they tend to congregate more towards the lower end of a particular HPI scale? And what might that mean in terms of their particular strengths, their opportunities, their day-to-day work style? The other aspect that we also tend to look at as well that can be useful is around that spread of scores across the team. So as I said, this can give us insight is there a lot of perhaps variability across the team around that scale? Perhaps that means a bit more of a balance, not one way more than the other coming through there. And similarly, depending on what's coming through for a particular team, may also mean perhaps some potential points of tension for team members if they are perhaps sitting at opposite ends of a scale as well and have different styles. So if we take this particular group graph as an example, this is where, again, I'll be opening up. So feel free to take yourself off mute, share your thoughts and ideas as we're going through. But if we look at this particular team's results on the group graph, firstly, opening it up, thinking about, where they're sitting on the relative scales, if they're more towards that higher or lower end. Giving us some context, let's pretend this is a executive team. What do we see as coming through perhaps as the potential strengths and potential opportunities based on where they're sitting? So happy to open it up and get everyone's thoughts and input.
Nothing in the chat as of yet, Lynn, other than a comment from Thomas Schroeder that you are covering everything off very well.
Thank you, Tom.
Hi, Lynn. It's Jess here. So your question is, what are the strengths or opportunities that I see in this aggregation would be the higher level of inquisitive and learning approach would suggest to me that they're going to be quite an innovative or kind of best practice oriented group of execs.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Thanks, Jess. Yeah, so certainly with the inquisitive being relatively high for this particular group, certainly going to suggest more of that tendency to gauge in more of that kind of innovative thinking, innovative problem solving as well. Maybe a bit more focused around that bigger picture, strategic side coming through there that we can see sometimes with the higher inquisitive. And then similar to what you said as well around best practice, certainly with the learning approach, may be able to leverage that knowledge and insights that they may have around, latest trends and developments and insights within their particular field or in their particular area. Any other insights that anyone can see or would like to pull out from this particular team's results?
Well, one thing I noticed is the fractions in adjustment and ambition. Mm-hmm. You've got two people very, very high, above the 90th percentile, so very driven, very much action-oriented, most likely, whereas the rest, they probably get frustrated by that kind of behavior.
Yeah, so very good pickup, Thomas. So when we see things coming through, like what we have here with the adjustment and ambition, where we have those two individuals that are probably quite different from what we typically see for the rest of the group here, certainly that can be when we are then starting to see some of those sources of potential conflict or tension within the group, because there are those differences in that style or approach. So it certainly can be a useful area to sometimes explore further to see how that is playing out. Is it causing that tension that we see coming through there as well?
Lynn, would you say that's the same for the interpersonal sensitivity? It's not as separated?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but it certainly could be, for these people up here that are higher on that interpersonal sensitivity, may tend to prefer more of that kind of tactful, considerate approach when they're communicating with each other, versus perhaps those who are lower on the interpersonal sensitivity that may have more of that blunt and direct approach, maybe more task focused and kind of let's get to the point things coming through there. Potentially that could be perhaps some sorts of tension within the team at times as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We've just got a raised hand from Sean as well.
Yeah. The guy with the light blue, the person, whatever, with the light blue, how do you deal with them whenever the rest of the team are seeing them so low on so many things? And how, does that not raise and create more conflict within the team that's unnecessary?
Yeah, so it's always, firstly, it's important when we're positioning going through the results as well, particularly if they are not certified themselves, we want to make sure that we highlight, regardless of where someone's sitting, their strengths and opportunities. So although this light blue person does have a number of lower scores, there's still going to be certain strengths that they're going to be bringing to the team. So, for example, with the high inquisitive that we were talking about before, while more broadly speaking, what we see in the team is being quite innovative, quite creative, thinking quite strategically, this particular individual may be good at bringing perhaps a particular strength to the team in terms of helping ground some of those ideas, thinking them through from more of that practical lens, or perhaps even from more of that implementation side, what may be feasible coming through there. So it is certainly, important to, you don't want to obviously, make someone cry or anything like that. You want to as well, ensure that people are keeping in mind, what are some of the strengths that perhaps if there are people with opposite scores coming through, that they also bring, how that may help bring some balance into the team at times as well coming through there. Any other comments, questions in relation to what we're seeing here before we then look at the frequency graph? So the frequency graphs I find are quite useful. So sometimes with all the dots it can get a little bit confusing on the eyes in terms of what we're seeing coming through there. But looking at the frequency graphs can certainly provide a bit more insight around what we're seeing in relation to the particular team. So as I said before, it breaks it down for the HPI. At the top we're seeing the percentage of those who scored in the high range, the middle the percentage of those who scored in the average range, and the percentage of those who scored in the lower range. So we certainly do see some things that we saw coming through in relation to the other group graphs that we're looking at. So again, we can see learning approach particularly high for this particular team with 67% scoring within that high range coming through there. Similarly for inquisitive with 44%, you can see that these are quite a large proportion of the team tend to have the tendencies associated with more scores within that higher range. But it can also provide some additional insights. So now we can see that when it comes to things like prudence, it's a bit easier to see, okay, there is actually quite an even split across the team in terms of those scoring in the low, average or high range coming through there as well. So probably a balance between, some people being quite flexible, adaptable, quick to make things happen, some quite from the other end, very structured, methodical in their approach to work, bringing that side, and then some in between that have a bit of a balance between both things as well. So the frequency graph can be very useful. Again, we're getting some additional insights coming through here as well. So we can see a bit more when it comes to interpersonal sensitivity, definitely seeing a larger proportion coming through within that higher range. And with adjustment now as well, we can also see that there's a larger proportion coming through in the lower range. You can think around what does that mean for the team. So, that tendency to work with more of that sense of passion, that sense of urgency coming through for this team, for a large proportion of members, but also potentially a bit more of that susceptibility to some of those daily stresses and pressures, and as well may have implications around perhaps how frequently we see some of those HDS derailers coming through as well. So if we move on to the HDS derailers, so as you're probably aware, it's not unusual to have team members that have at least a few elevations on some of the various HDS scales that come through. So having some of those characteristics that may undermine the performance of the team. So particularly with the HDS, we're looking at when they are under stress and under pressure. So with the HDS, these are behaviours that may interfere with the team's ability to, build those relationships, to maintain that cohesive relationships and connections with one another, as well as having that cohesive direction when it comes to accomplishing their goals as well. And when it comes to the derailers, particularly when you have a large proportion of the team that have the same kind of derailleur, this is when it may become more of a blind spot for them, because it's more likely that the associated behaviours around that are likely to be regarded as normal. And this is, this is just how we operate. This is how we do things when we're under stress and pressure, and that they may lack insight around that collective behaviour piece coming through there. What we also find is that when there are shared derailers in a team, what that can mean is that it can be more salient and exaggerated in terms of the impact that it has around those tendencies that we see there as well. So what we can find is it can almost have like this multiplication effect when multiple people have the same derailer within a team. And what we find is that when team members share the same kind of response that they have to stress, the kind of situations that may trigger that derailing behaviour may be reinforced or exasperated by other team members that exhibit similar reactions. So, for example, if we take excitable, if one person is under pressure, then they're responding, more emotionally, they're, letting their frustration and irritation show. That may then trigger others within their team that also have that higher excitable and kind of amplify that. And then they're kind of bouncing and feeding off each other in terms of some of those excitable derailment tendencies that we're seeing. Or if we take skeptical for another example, if someone, when under that stress and pressure, more inclined to become more defensive, more critical during those times, perhaps, if someone says something to them that kind of triggers that defensive behaviour, they respond defensively, and then it triggers others to defensive behaviour as well. So it can have that multiplication effect coming through and kind of impact the team in that particular way as well, to the point where it can then really have that impact around that team's performance and that team's reputation more broadly as well. So similar to what we saw before, this time we're looking at the HDS. So again, I'll open it up to you in terms of, what do you see coming through here for this group in terms of what derailers may be more prominent for them and hinder their effectiveness when they are under that stress or pressure, or perhaps even when they are more complacent.
As we open up to those thoughts, Lynn, I'll raise that Thomas has asked a very common BD question that we get about these reports. So are these data reports and frequency reports that you're walking us through now inclusions of the Hogan team report, or is there a distinction between the two?
Yeah, great question. So they are two distinct products that you can purchase. So there's the Hogan group graphs. Typically, a lot of our clients may purchase that on their own when they have group data. And then there's also the team report, which can also be purchased separately. Right, so opening it back up to the group, what do you see for this particular team in terms of their derailers?
Great.
Me again, Lynn. So definitely that mischievousness is clearly on average they're quite high, but I would say the whole moving against cluster seems to be more elevated, far from a few, the kind of light blue and the green, so we're starting to see a bit of a split there as well. So I reckon just from what you were saying before, particularly with whoever light blue is, that there will be quite a push-pull effect in the group dynamic, that when the moving against cluster people kick off, that will push Mr. Light Blue into his reserved kind of coping mechanisms.
Yeah.
Yeah, but there's a lot of colour to work with, but that's just what stood out in my first glance.
Yeah. But you've picked up on the key things there, Jess. So yeah, certainly around some of those more moving against cluster derailers are certainly coming through more elevated for this particular group. Particularly, the mischievous is probably the higher one on average coming through there. So certainly more of that tendency to take risks, push the boundaries, test the limits coming through there, perhaps a bit more hasty and impulsive coming through there as well. But again, perhaps, for light blue, during that time, you may get, for them in particular, a bit more of that kind of moving away then, a tendency to withdraw coming through them.
And I suppose it makes sense with HPI as well, because that kind of innovative best practice lens or tendency to take risks and give it a go, that kind of marries up with what we then see as an overplayed strength in that. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So particularly, around pushing the boundaries, testing the limits probably serves well in some respects when, trying to think of innovative ideas, different kind of solutions coming through there. But then, of course, needing to keep in mind what can be some of the risk around that. So it can be a bit easier with the frequency graph to see a bit more around what's coming through. So certainly, the mischievous coming through as a bit more of a bigger one, as well as the bold for this particular group. So, a lot of confidence, a lot of assertiveness coming through there, that willingness to push boundaries, test the limits, but the risk of what can happen when they may overplay and overdo that. We can also see some of the other ones that came through a bit more strongly as well. So there was still a fair bit of those in the moderate to high risk range around the reserved and leisurely pieces coming through there as well. So again, there may be at times a bit of this tendency to still withdraw and perhaps not be as communicative with others. Or with the higher leisurely, what we can see with that is may at times voice that agreement, but then still really value that independence and going away and focusing on their own particular priorities and agenda coming through there as well. And then we also had a bit of the excitable, which is perhaps not surprising given what we also saw with the lower adjustment for this particular group. There is that risk around that passion, that energy, that sense of urgency coming through there. If there are those setbacks, those challenges and difficulties that they may encounter when under that stress and pressure, it may turn to more of that excitable behaviour that we can see coming through. It can be interesting sometimes to look at when there are a large proportion that still have a particularly within the lower range. So, for example, when we were working with a particular client, there was a group that had a very large proportion that were sitting within the lower range and now below risk. but it was still feeding into some of the things that were coming through with the team. So, for example, there was lots of challenging, inappropriately, those who were in more senior roles, given lower levels of dutiful within the team, likely to be feeding into that as well. So certainly, normally where we typically focus is certainly around what's coming through more prevalently for the team, around some of those higher risk scores coming through there. But it can also be useful to have a look what may be coming through as well around particularly large proportions of very low scores. And this is, again, where if you have the two together, it can also look, all right, for this group, there is actually quite a large number of people who are sitting fairly low around that diligent piece. So does this mean, when they're not self-managing, perhaps things are falling through the cracks? They're not paying enough attention around ensuring there's that kind of sufficient structure, attention to detail, planning, those kinds of things. Because we're seeing quite a large number of people scoring quite low around the diligence scale as well, which we can also see in the frequency graph. So it can be useful to also look at the other end. If there are perhaps really a number who have quite a number of low scores, what may be the implications around that as well. And then with the MBPI, so this is really useful in providing insight around the team culture, their shared values. And research has shown that when it comes to shared values, these can really help in terms of making working in the team more enjoyable, helping that team cohesion, can also contribute to greater team efficiency and effectiveness and help stabilize the team and reduce turnover as well. And when it comes to values, it really can help influence, or it can certainly influence around the kind of choices and decisions that they make as a group, can give insight into perhaps some potential unconscious biases that the group may have as well around their decisions, their preferences that they have when it comes to their work environment and working together as well. So generally what we're looking at is really, where are we seeing the group's values tending to align? And if there is that high level of alignment, that can certainly be very positive in contributing to successful performance, contributing to that sense of cohesiveness in the team. Whereas if we see a lot of misalignment within the team around their values, that can perhaps be having an impact around their performance, cohesiveness, perhaps bringing in some of that tension into the team as well. Of course, you're never going to get 100% alignment coming through there, but you want to have some level of alignment to help feed into that sense of cohesion into the team as well. So similar to before, this is now we're looking at the team's group graph around the MBPI. So again, open up that discussion around what you see in terms of this group's perhaps culture, shared value based on what's coming through in their MBPI.
Well, I guess in line with the high learning approach and the high science on average is not surprising, which probably can interpret they need a lot of information, a lot of data. They were fairly prudent in their approach, which means they could probably take longer to make decisions. But the low recognition means they're probably good playing together as a team, so they're not seeking visibility as much. So there is another anchor. And the majority is in the low range there. Low tradition, another anchor there, probably very open to innovative, which is aligned with their big picture thinking from the HPI.
Yeah, and that's a really good point that you've raised, Thomas. So we can see it's useful to look at both where they've scored, we see collectively coming through in the higher range, but also when you see collectively coming through in the lower ranges as well. That certainly points to still, having those anchor points, those shared values that can provide quite good insight around the team as well. Any other insights?
A question from me, actually. Would you say that this is about, like, in terms of how aligned this particular group are. Is this well aligned, above average or below average? Like, is that kind of spread normal?
Yeah, so it's not unusual to see some spread coming through in relation to the values. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's not unusual to see something like this coming through in a profile. You're going to probably see some values where you're going to get a bit more of a spread coming through in a team, like what we have in commerce is pretty much spread through.
Even spread,
But generally what you'll find is normally there'll be about 3 to 4 values where you'll find that they tend to kind of collectively score, the majority tend to kind of collectively score quite similarly, like what you're seeing here with learning approach. So you may see, of course, still 1 or 2 exceptions around that, but you'll see that there will be, particular values that come through where the majority do tend to score particularly high or particularly low. So you may get a bit more clustering than this in terms of the values than what you're seeing on this particular sample. Like you might see that rather than having 3, maybe just 1 from the ones that I typically see. But you will find that the majority tend to be quite similar coming through.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Good question. So again, the frequency graph, it does help in terms of thinking through, all right, if we look at in terms of groups of those low, average and high, where are we seeing them sitting on the particular values? And certainly, what was picked up by Thomas around, the lower recognition, certainly seeing a very large proportion of the team scoring in that lower range. So, certainly speaks to that tendency to share that credit, not necessarily interested in having that high level of visibility coming through there. Similarly, what was also picked up around that lower tradition, which may feed into what we also saw with this team around that tendency to be more innovative, exploring different ideas, different solutions, and with the lower tradition, similarly, can connect it to things like that, high mischievous. This is probably a team that's willing to push the boundaries, test the limits. Let's not stick to conventions, what's been done in the past. Let's do things differently. Try new things coming through there for them, and with the science as well. So not surprising, probably the higher science with the higher learning approach, that interest around, again, valuing that knowledge, that research, that data, engaging in some of that analysis information coming through there as well. And we can also pick up some additional ones coming through as well. So majority of the team, quite lower around the power piece, which you may remember from the HBI. There was also a lot of people within that team that had that lower ambition piece as well, or sitting below the 50th percentile coming through there as well. So, useful to think about, all right, well, what is the implications then for this team if the majority of them are low power? For example, if this was a senior executive team and the majority are low power, what does that mean in terms of who's driving that high performance and that productivity and that achievement piece coming through there? Who's stepping in and sticking up to ensure that others are being motivated and driven and held accountable to achieving those outcomes as well. So that is going through the group graphs. And then, as I said, the other option that can also use is the Hogan team report. So in terms of this report, again, it is really designed to really understand the team's mix of strengths and weaknesses or opportunities coming through there, and looks at it in terms of 3 different aspects. So one aspect is around understanding the natural roles that people are likely to gravitate towards based on their particular personality. The other aspect is around looking at a team's collective derailers, what that may mean, and finally, what are the team's key values as well. So the team report, it is more comprehensive relative to the group graphs in that it also provides a lot of information around what does this mean for the team in terms of what we see coming through in their results, around their strengths, their opportunities, but also provides a number of development recommendations and development advice for the team as well, based on where they're sitting in each of the different sections of the report as well. So in terms of the team roles, the team report is looking at informal roles that people can tend to gravitate towards that are important for effective team operation. And these are roles that members tend to naturally gravitate towards based on their personality. And this particular section of the report is based on the HPI. And it's important to consider the team's purpose and function within the organisation to kind of think about what may be the ideal balance across each of these different roles. So you may find that some may be weighted more heavily for optimal performance, particularly if perhaps they are more of a specialised team. That may be when you want them to be more heavily weighted in some areas rather than others. So in terms of the different team areas that it looks at, so it looks at results. So these are those individuals that tend to naturally take on that role of directing the team. So have that focus on results and getting things done, you know, those individuals that are comfortable taking charge, organising work, clarifying goals, coordinating the team, and providing direction for others. With pragmatists, so these are those individuals who are quite practical, they're willing to challenge those different ideas on the basis of practicality. So, that's a great idea. That other group perhaps, is very innovative, but what about this? What about the practical implications around that? Innovation. So for this particular report, it's really around recognising when perhaps conditions have changed around the team and when they may need to adapt to those changes as well. So it's around having that focus around change, vision, as well as enjoying problem solving and generating different creative ideas and solutions coming through there as well. Process. So this is really about the implementation side of things. So looking at the details of executing ideas, using processes and systems to complete tasks. So tending to have that focus around structure, tasks, ensuring the details and processes are covered. And then finally, we have relationships. So this one is those individuals that are more likely to focus around team relations, wanting to have that interpersonal harmony and cooperation within the team. And as well, can be those individuals that are more likely to be a champion for customers and other stakeholders within the organisation as well. So when we're looking at the results on this particular section of the team report, basically the number that you see in the circle there is the percentage of team members who fill that particular role. And team members may fill more than one role. So someone may be, fulfill both that relationship role, but also that process role as well. And basically with the numbers, anything that is 20 or below is considered low. So for this particular group, we would say that pragmatist role is quite low in this particular group. And then anything 50 or above is considered to be high. So for this particular group, we would say the process and relationship roles are fulfilled quite highly within this particular team. So looking at these particular results, again, I'll just open it up, get your thoughts. If you were looking at this particular team, particularly given their particular, high scores and their particular low scores, what do you think this team may look like day to day? What might we expect from this team?
I guess I kick off again.
Thank you, Thomas.
I was going to do the same too. I was like,
Very much personal relationship team. Again, combine this with this low need for recognition. They're good to communicate, but they tend to be very academic in their approach. That low level of pragmatism is a bit of a red flag. Their high learning approach, high science, they want to make a very informed decision, but they could basically be paralyzed by analysis.
Yes. So certainly, yeah, with the low pragmatism, we'd be wondering, all right, how are some of those, particularly some of those more creative and innovative ideas as well, how are they being balanced out with some of those practical considerations coming through there as well. So with as I said, with the HPI, it looks at it in terms of team roles. And then with the HDS, the next section is really the team derailers. So this is the section that is based on the HDS. For this particular section, the number in the center that you see there is the average across all team members. And then the numbers in the outside represent the proportion of team or the number of team at each risk level. So for example, with excitable, 5 are falling within the high risk range. None within the other range. So this report is different from the other groups, that's why it's a bit different. But for this team, a high number of people, 5 people in that high risk range. And if you see a number in red, basically what that means is that the majority of the team share the derailer for that particular team. So for this team, can certainly see the moving away cluster, very shared by the majority of the team, and this pattern of response when they are under stress and pressure coming through here, and then also as well the higher imaginative coming through. So under stress and pressure with the high moving away cluster, perhaps during those times less likely to be as communicative with each other, not as visible coming through there as well, may get more of that emotionality when it comes to, perhaps making those decisions when it comes to their interactions with others as well. The high excitable may have some of those more emotionally intense reactions to each other during those times, and things like the leisurely, maybe that public agreement around, yeah, that's a good idea, that's a good thought, but privately, still adhering to their own agenda, their own thoughts, and then as well with the skeptical being higher, maybe more hypervigilant around, potential mistreatment, those kinds of things coming through there. May impact the level of trust and open and honest communication within the team as well, and even potentially a bit of slowing down in some of that action and decision making with some of that high cautious coming through as well. And then the final part of the report looks at team culture. So this is the part of the report based on the MVPI. So again, the numbers in the circle represent the average percentile for the team. The numbers on the outside represent the proportion of the team who scored in that particular quartile. So for example, for this particular report, 7 scored in the top quartile when it comes to power. And if more than 2/3 of the team score either very high or very low, that's when it's seen as a shared value for that team, or a shared anchor that can be used as well. So for example, power and hedonism came through as blue because it's quite high for this particular team in terms of the number of people who score quite high on those scales. And then science is also a shared anchor for this team, in this case, for this particular team, because a large proportion of them scored low. So a bit different from the team in the other group graph that we saw before. So for this group, the key drivers, or the key values, I should say, that are likely to drive the culture are really those blue ones that we see coming through here. So we can see, with power, very driven to obtain results, likely to value that achievement and perhaps evaluate others based on those terms. For this team as well, with the high hedonism, prefer those work environments where you can have some of that enjoyment, where you can set their own priorities coming through there. And then with the really low science, for this particular team, maybe more intuitive and perhaps prefer more of that analysis over action as well. So with the team report, it covers those 3 sections. As I said, there are also additional pages for the team report that provide more detail around the implications, potential development recommendations, and tips for the team coming through there as well. It also shows you a breakdown of which particular members have those shared derailers or have those shared values or fall within a particular team role as well, so you can see who's contributing around that. And with the team report, there are a lot of supporting resources. So if you're using it as part of, a team debrief or a team, team day, team program, there are also, additional facilitator power packs and supporting materials as well to be able to use it to really pull out the best insights you can for the team and get them to use it to start thinking about next steps in terms of development planning. How can they leverage their strengths? How can they address some of the opportunities that have come up for the team as well? So that is all I have in terms of the content that I put together, but I'm happy to open it up now to see if anyone has any further questions, anything they'd like to ask around aggregating Hogan data for teams.
Thanks, Lynn, very much. Amy has raised another very, very common BD question about the Hogan team report. Do you get access to the full individual participant scores when ordering the Hogan team report, or is that, again, a separate purchase?
So I don't believe it puts everyone's scores in the reports. So normally it may be a separate purchase that you would do as part of that.
To expand on that, Amy, we typically run a program for individual self and other awareness where we run either the Hogan Insights series or the Hogan Leadership Forecast series for the participants, and then we run the Hogan team report for the entire team as a facilitation tool.
Yeah, so for a lot of our clients, as Josh said, a lot of the time when they are using the Hogans as part of team development, often what we'll have is before they have the team session, have the individual one-on-one debrief, go through their own profile, understand their individual results, what it looks like for them, and then they will come together, look at it then collectively as a team. Now what do they see? Now what does that mean for them collectively in terms of their strengths and opportunities and those values that pull them together? Any other questions?
Yeah, Penelope here. I was just wondering when you have in all of those different areas, so the HPI, the HDS and the value, the culture, when you've got really average scores, so you don't have a high spread and you've got relatively average to low average, how you might interpret that in terms of the team whose derailers are tending to be around cautious, a bit risk averse and so on. Is that sort of average score a bit reflective of a slightly risk averse team?
If there were more risk averse from the HPI, you may, particularly if they're higher around things like cautious, you may still expect things like perhaps some lower ambition and high prudence coming through there. Often, we can find that those who have high cautious may tend to have a bit more of that lower ambition coming through because, with the lower ambition, that can also be similar things around perhaps not being as assertive, wanting to perhaps stick more with the status quo rather than perhaps taking on those challenges to stretch themselves. So you may see, particularly for ambition, that may be pulled down a bit more on that particular scale. And similarly with prudence, you may find that one will be a bit more pulled up if you do have more of that risk aversion coming through there, because there are aspects of that are measured as part of the prudence in terms of that day-to-day scale as well.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
Another Hogan team report question, Lynn.
Yep.
What would we consider the ideal number of participants to include in a Hogan team report?
Yeah, so, teams vary, obviously, in terms of number. Ideally, normally we say, if you have, say, between 8 and 12, tends to be a nice number around what you see coming through there. Typically, we recommend you'd want a minimum of 5 people normally before you look at doing the team report. But we can go up much higher than that. So I think normally the highest is like around 30. Once you're getting more than that, it's getting a bit more unwieldy. But normally you're probably looking around 8 to 12.
Amy's raised, again, she would love some tips on suggestions for low adjustment teams. Mm-hmm. When we find that there's a general trend towards that low adjustment, particularly in terms of focus strategies on what they can control.
Mm-hmm. Yes. With lower adjustment teams, certainly, you want them to ensure that they are leveraging the strengths that you can see with that low adjustment. So continuing to bring that sense of passion, that energy, that sense of urgency that they bring coming through there. With the low adjustment teams, of course, we need to be mindful of, and help them to be mindful. Sometimes there is that tendency when people are lower on adjustment to be harder on themselves. And so as a team, this can be the team that does tend to be harder on themselves around, what they may be seeing coming through in terms of their opportunities, when it comes to even day-to-day, their performance, they may be harder on themselves in terms of how they're tracking. So certainly when it comes to teams that are lower on adjustment as well, because there can be that tendency to be more susceptible to daily stresses and pressures, it's useful for them to understand what are perhaps some of their trigger points for them that may lead them to feel some of that stress and tension throughout the day. So understanding what their trigger points are and having those strategies in place that will help to manage and deal with those particular situations or particular people that may be perhaps contributing to some of those feelings as well. But definitely, want to stress that if there is a low adjustment team, that self-compassion piece is very important for them because, as I said, that tendency to be a bit more harder, self-critical on themselves. So important for them to, make sure they celebrate what they're doing well, focus on the positives, celebrate the good things that they do and bring each day, but also some of that self-compassion as well in terms of understanding that they can be more susceptible to that stress and pressure. So it's important for them to also ensure that they put in place those stress management strategies so that stress and pressure is not going to be taking that toll on them, whether it's, for them, you don't want them to burn out or, whether it's around their performance, things like that, having those stress management strategies both for when they are at work, but, also practicing that self-care outside of work as well often becomes quite important for teams that do have a large proportion of those who are lower around that adjustment scale. Any other questions, Josh, that came through chat?
Just lots of thank yous and well done, Sally.
Very nice, thank you. Okay, I'll open up just in case anyone has any final burning questions that they want to ask.
I'll jump in again, Lynn, and say thank you from our team for everyone. And as we've been going through, I've been popping in links and general info into the chat. But if you do want to discuss anything further with our BD team or with our consultants, please reach out to info@peterberry.com.au and we will definitely get in touch. And yes, today's recording will be shared.
Great. Thank you, everyone. And as Josh said, certainly feel free to reach out if you do have any questions, require any further information. As I said, we also have a lot of supporting information and resources as well. So if you want to get access to that, which can be really useful, even if you're not using the actual team report, it can still be useful to see things like the technical manual and the report because it's still got good development advice and recommendations in there that you can still apply if, say, you're using the group graphs as well. But thank you, everyone. That concludes today's practical practitioner session, and hopefully you'll be able to join us for the next one next month.